June 1944, Normandy. Morning arrived, not with birdsong, but with the wet hiss of grass bending under boots, the smell of torn earth, and the long metallic echo of artillery still rolling somewhere beyond the hedgerows. Dawn had not fully lifted. Mist clung low over the fields, hanging in the lanes like smoke that had forgotten where it came from. In a shallow ditch beside a broken cart road, a German infantryman stopped for a moment and stared at something so ordinary it seemed almost unreal. There, in the mud and trampled clover, lay the remains of an American breakfast, a tin cup still dark with coffee, a plate crusted with yellow egg, white bread gone damp at the edges, a smear of jam bright as blood in the gray light. The meal looked interrupted, not abandoned by starving men, but merely postponed by soldiers who expected to eat again. In that one glance, between the flies, the shell craters, and the distant cough of machine guns, the war seemed to split open and reveal something larger than weapons. It was not only armies fighting in Normandy. It was systems, harvests, factories, railroads, calories. It was an entire civilization carried across an ocean, and now steaming faintly from a breakfast plate in the French mud. For years, many German soldiers had been taught to imagine America not as a patient, organized industrial democracy, but as a soft and corrupted world ruled by money. Nazi propaganda in 1944 explicitly warned Germans that Americanization would mean enslavement under plutocracy, that for Americans labor was only a hunt for the dollar, and that the American bomber flies for his pay. The image was carefully constructed, the American as materialistic, rootless, shallow, dangerous in power, but hollow in spirit. Such propaganda mattered because it prepared the German soldier to believe that endurance, sacrifice, and hardness would always defeat comfort. In that worldview, the man who ate better must fight worse. The man who came from full shelves must crumble in a muddy trench. Hunger, deprivation, and obedience were not presented as signs of national failure, but as proof of moral seriousness. So when German troops first collided with the American army in the West, many did not merely meet a new enemy. They met the collapse of an idea they had been fed for years, that a democratic society, rich in food and private comfort, could not also be ruthless, persistent, and frighteningly efficient in war. That is why the breakfast mattered. Not because it was luxurious in any grand civilian sense, and not because every American soldier ate like a hotel guest under fire, but because even the fragments of American wartime food carried a logic the Germans understood at once. Coffee that was real coffee, not just memory darkened with chicory and roasted grain. Meat that had arrived canned, measured, packed, and transported across the Atlantic without collapsing into scarcity. Sugar enough to sweeten bitterness. Bread white enough to look almost indecent against a European landscape that had been rationed, substituted, diluted, and exhausted by years of blockade and war. In Nazi Germany, coffee substitutes had become deeply normal. A major study of food politics under the Third Reich notes that by 1938, Germans were drinking enormous quantities of ersatz, coffee made from chicory, roasted barley, or oats, and that after 1939, the loss of imports made such substitutes even more central to daily life for civilians and soldiers alike. A man who had spent months swallowing imitation warmth from a dented cup could smell the difference before he even saw it. Real coffee was not merely a taste. It was proof that somewhere behind the enemy line there still existed factories, ships, fuel, warehouses, order, and confidence. The United States Army did not stumble into that abundance. It built it deliberately. Official quartermaster history records that roughly 1 billion special rations were procured between 1941 and 1945, costing about $675 million. These were not only standard field meals. They included K rations, C rations, D rations, 10-in-1 group packs, mountain rations, jungle rations, desert rations, lifeboat rations, airborne emergency packets, and specialized food systems for men who might fight in snow, surf, jungle, or sky. In 1944 alone, more than 105 million K rations were procured. The sheer variety tells its own story. This was not merely a nation feeding soldiers. It was a nation industrializing nourishment itself, engineering morale into cardboard, tin, chocolate, powdered coffee, and compressed cereal. When German soldiers found the traces of an American meal, they were seeing the edge of that vast machine. Behind one plate of eggs or one ration carton stood Midwestern slaughterhouses, canneries, rail networks, merchant shipping, depots in Britain, beach dumps in Normandy, field kitchens under canvas, and quartermasters who had turned logistics into a branch of combat power. The plate in the mud was small. The world behind it was immense. The famous K-ration breakfast was itself a miniature expression of that system. The official specification listed a canned meat product, biscuits, a compressed cereal bar, soluble coffee, a fruit bar, gum, sugar tablets, 4 cigarettes, water purification tablets, a can opener, toilet paper, and a wooden spoon. It was compact, imperfect, often disliked by American troops for being too light and too repetitive, but to an enemy who had been told that democracies produced softness instead of endurance, it represented something more important than culinary beauty. It represented planning. Even the breakfast had architecture. Even the cup of coffee had a supply chain. The Americans could reduce a morning meal to a portable formula and still surround it with sugar, tobacco, sweets, and convenience. It was not elegant. It was powerful. German soldiers, especially in the West during the final year of the war, were increasingly familiar with shortage, improvisation, and substitution. They knew what a hungry army looked like. They knew what an army at the end of its tether sounded like. The American breakfast, by contrast, sounded like cardboard opening cleanly, metal tabs snapping free, hot water poured with confidence, and spoons scraping the bottom of cans that had come from a continent untouched by invasion. And the K-ration was only one layer of the American food story. The larger C-ration system, described by the U.S. Department of War, offered canned mains that expanded over time into stews, chopped ham, eggs, and potatoes, meat and spaghetti and tomato sauce, meat and noodles, pork and beans, ham and lima beans, and chicken and vegetables, with biscuits, gum, candy, and cigarettes added alongside. 3 C-ration meals a day gave about 3,700 calories. The National Park Service notes that wartime combat rations broadly delivered around 3,000 to 3,600 calories and included candy, freeze-dried coffee, and canned meat, while instant coffee entered American field rations beginning in 1941, and Spam alone was shipped in wartime quantities exceeding 100 million pounds. It is easy, from a distance, to mock canned eggs or powdered coffee, but in the ruined geography of 1944 Europe, such things were astonishing. The marvel was not refinement. The marvel was consistency. The food kept arriving. It arrived after storms, after U-boat campaigns, after amphibious landings, after blown bridges and wrecked rail lines. It arrived in enough quantity that American soldiers could complain about monotony while their enemies stared in disbelief at the fact that monotony itself could be so full. In the hedgerow country, perception changed slowly, then all at once. At first, the German soldier might have explained what he saw in familiar ways. Perhaps the Americans were wasteful. Perhaps they were careless. Perhaps this was only a lucky sector, a well-fed unit, a temporary excess that war would soon erase. Yet the signs repeated themselves. More tins, more chocolate wrappers, more cigarette cartons, more coffee, more vehicles stacked behind the lines, more engineering equipment, more fuel, more bread. A breakfast plate is only convincing for a second. But a breakfast plate followed by trucks, bulldozers, radios, fresh uniforms, artillery ammunition, replacement troops, portable bridges, medical evacuation, hot chow, ice cream rumors, and endless aircraft overhead becomes an argument. Soon it is not an accident. It is a worldview made visible. The German army had long prized hardness, discipline, and the ability to endure lack. But endurance has a secret weakness. It mistakes survival for strength. It can survive longer on less. Yes. Yet when it meets an enemy that can endure and still provide more, the old moral arithmetic begins to fail. The Americans were not living in a fairy tale. Their own home front rationed staples, their own infantry cursed cold cans, stale crackers, and powdered substitutes. The K-ration, the Department of War later noted, delivered only 2,830 calories for 3 meals and was often criticized by the men who had to live on it. Commanders tried to supplement it with bread, rice, or C-rations whenever they could. That detail matters, because it sharpens the contrast rather than softening it. Even the American ration, regarded as insufficient by American standards, could appear extraordinary to men coming from a shrinking world of shortages. When German soldiers encountered the leftovers of such food, they were not looking at abundance in some absolute paradise. They were looking at wartime abundance, flawed, industrial, improvised, and still beyond what much of Europe could sustain by 1944. This is why the emotional impact was so powerful. The Americans did not need to feast to seem overwhelming. They needed only to keep eating. Imagine then the inward arithmetic of a young German grenadier who had crossed France under blackout skies, slept in orchards, and drunk bitter substitute coffee from a soot-blackened pot. He had been told that Germany was the harder civilization, the one that had burned away comfort and become pure will. Then he saw American soldiers in foxholes with instant coffee. He found breakfast cans with ham and eggs. He watched artillery fire rolled in by men who also had cigarettes, sugar, and fresh socks. Hardness did not vanish before such evidence, but it became haunted. If sacrifice was always superior, why did the well-fed enemy keep advancing? If the man from the world of money fought only for pay, why did he wade ashore into machine gun fire? If democracy produced only softness, why did its breakfast arrive more reliably than the Reich's promises? The German soldier could cling to ideology and still feel that small crack opening. Wars are often remembered for speeches, offensives, and treaties. Yet whole belief systems also collapse through tiny humiliations. A loaf of white bread, a butter ration thicker than expected, the smell of genuine coffee in a landscape where one's own side has been living on substitutes. By late war, the shock no longer belonged only to those who glimpsed abandoned plates in combat. It followed captured Germans into a larger and more systematic confrontation with America. The 1929 Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be treated at a standard equivalent to the base camps of the captor nation, with the same food, clothing, medical care, exercise, and recreation offered to them. The United States applied that principle on a scale almost unimaginable to exhausted Wehrmacht men. National archives, material records, that by May 1945, the United States held 425,871 Axis POWs, of whom 371,683 were German in hundreds of camps across the country. The War Department was responsible for guarding, clothing, quartering, transporting, and medically caring for them. These were not details buried in legal manuals. They became lived experience. The defeated German soldier who once crouched beside a breakfast plate in Normandy might, months later, find himself in Texas, Kansas, Arizona, Oklahoma, or Michigan, discovering that the enemy who had seemed rich at the front looked richer still in captivity. The camps themselves added to the bewilderment. American records show not only barracks and guards, but schools, libraries, theaters, music programs, sports, religious services, and inspected sanitation systems with flush toilets and concrete floors replacing cruder arrangements. Prisoners assigned to labor were paid, their hours regulated, and their rest periods specified. Camp reports tracked books, performances, recreation, and hygiene with bureaucratic seriousness. To a German raised on propaganda about America as spiritually empty and socially diseased, even this paperwork carried ideological weight. The enemy did not merely have more food, it had procedures for decency. The forms themselves seemed to imply surplus. Enough time to inspect latrines, enough confidence to organize libraries, enough fuel to run the whole machine without collapsing into chaos. What defeated many illusions was not American kindness in some sentimental sense, but American normality. The system worked on ordinary days. Men were fed because feeding them was part of an established order. The abundance was not theatrical. That made it more devastating. One German prisoner, Helmut W., wrote in his journal words that cut through all abstraction. Here we eat more in a single day than during a whole week at home. That sentence matters because it is not ideological. It is anatomical. It begins in the stomach. Hunger is one of the most obedient servants of doctrine until hunger meets a table. Then the body begins to vote against the mind. In the American camps, food was not merely a matter of survival. It became evidence in a trial the prisoners had not expected to face. If the United States was the decayed society of Nazi caricature, why was its captivity cleaner, fuller, and less desperate than the life many of them had known in uniform? Why did prison resemble stability more than service in the Reich's final campaigns? The American re-education effort certainly used newspapers, films, and political discussion, but the historian of that program makes a harsher and more revealing point. The best argument for democracy was often practical rather than ideological. It was visible affluence. Prisoners associated democracy with the ability to live comfortably, to eat regularly, to exist without the permanent abrasion of shortage. Freedom first appeared to some of them not as a constitution but as a full tray. Translated letters from German POWs in America show the same transformation in quieter tones. George Kellerman wrote that the food was very good, and in one letter he told his wife not to send him any food because the camp had more than plenty, and she would need it more in Germany. That one phrase, more than plenty, says more about wartime contrast than a shelf of political speeches. In Europe, wives saved crusts, watered soups, and stretch the weak against the thinning edge of supply. In America, the prisoner was telling home not to sacrifice for him because captivity already gave him more than he could reasonably ask for. Around such camps, local Americans sometimes complained that prisoners were treated too well, calling the camps the Fritz Ritz. The nickname was bitter but revealing. Even mockery acknowledged abundance. And for the German prisoner, mockery was easier to bear than the dawning realization that enemy democracy had enough confidence to feed him properly while it was still waging a global war. The eyewitness accounts can become almost cinematic in their excess, but they are documented. A Michigan study of German POW experience records observers describing the best of meats in ample quantities cooking on their army stoves, pound cartons of creamery butter stacked high and cut into generous squares, ice cream once or twice a week, and occasional cake. One former prisoner later remembered a mattress in American captivity after having slept on straw in the German army. Another recalled with painful clarity the first good farm meal in Michigan, writing that hunger had caused them real pain and that he could still see prisoners, ravenous, falling over piles of beefsteaks in a workshop where they were fed. To modern ears, these memories can sound almost too symbolic, as if post-war recollection polished them into allegory. But that is exactly why they matter. These men did not remember only walls, guards, and defeat. They remembered butter, mattresses, beefsteaks, and the humiliation of discovering that the enemy's prison could feel materially richer than the homeland for which they had fought. The symbolic object that keeps returning through all of this is coffee. At the front, it appears as steam rising from an American cup in the hedgerow dawn. In Germany, it survives as ersatz, dark but unreal, made from chicory or grain, a ritual preserved after the original had been drained away. In the ration, it reappears as soluble coffee packed beside canned meat and sugar. In the POW camp, it becomes ordinary again, just another warm drink among regular meals. In the National Park Service account of wartime food culture, instant coffee entered American field rations in 1941 and later moved into care packages sent to Europe and Japan after the war. That continuity is telling. Coffee traveled with the Americans not just as a stimulant, but almost as a civilizational signature. It moved from the factory to the foxhole, from the foxhole to the prison camp, from the prison camp to post-war relief. For the defeated soldier, the cup could come to mean something uncomfortably large. Not just that Americans had coffee, but that they had enough order, enough industry, and enough surplus to make coffee routine while half the world was burning. This did not turn every German prisoner into a Democrat overnight. Many remained bitter. Many clung to old loyalties, or separated material admiration from political conversion. Some could enjoy the food and still hate the society that provided it. Some noticed American hypocrisies as well, including racial inequality and regional poverty. The letters and studies do not describe a magical moral awakening. They describe something slower and, in some ways, more unsettling: disorientation. The world had been explained to these men in one set of colors. Then reality arrived in another. The United States used explicit re-education programs, newspapers such as Der Ruf, and carefully designed intellectual diversion to reshape political attitudes. Yet even that program's historian concludes that affluence itself was often the stronger teacher. Prisoners rode trains through a country they had expected to find bomb-damaged and exhausted, only to see intact towns, vast distances, and, as some accounts emphasize, astonishing numbers of automobiles. That experience did not instantly produce virtue, but it did produce doubt, and doubt is the first crack in fanatic certainty. Back in Normandy, in the imagined scene that opens this story, the German soldier does not yet know any of this. He does not know that hundreds of thousands of his countrymen will be fed in camps across the United States. He does not know that one day some of them will write home asking families not to send food because America has more than enough. He does not know about Fort Reno reports listing theater and music, or about prisoners reading in camp libraries under the guard of the state they were taught to despise. All he knows is the cup, the smell, the plate, the intolerable normality of breakfast in a place where normal life should have died. That is how great historical transformations often begin, not with a lecture, but with a contradiction so plain that the senses cannot ignore it. The eye reports what doctrine denied. The nose confirms what propaganda mocked. The stomach understands before the intellect is ready. There was, of course, another side to the same revelation. The American breakfast plate did not merely symbolize generosity. It symbolized capacity for prolonged war. Behind the eggs and coffee stood the same industrial order that built landing craft: Liberty ships, B-24s, Sherman tanks, bulldozers, pontoon bridges, field hospitals, and replacement depots. Quartermaster records speak in the cool language of procurement, but beneath that language lies one of the central truths of the war in the West. The United States could convert farms, factories, chemistry, packaging, and transport into combat endurance on a continental scale. Over 300 million 10-in-1 rations were procured from mid-1943 to the end of the war. The C ration cycled through numerous canned meat varieties. The D ration packed concentrated calories into chocolate bars designed for emergency survival. The original design principle for field rationing had aimed at nothing less than sustaining the average soldier under field conditions with 4,000, or preferably 4,500 calories. Not every ration met that ideal, but the ambition itself reveals the mindset. This was a state thinking in tonnage, not crumbs. To German soldiers raised inside a regime that glorified sacrifice, the discovery was profound. They had been taught that real nations purified themselves through lack, that abundance softened character, that the struggle itself was moral wealth. But in the American case, abundance did not dissolve discipline, it reinforced it. The soldier who could count on hot coffee, cigarettes, canned meat, sugar, bread, and replacement supplies did not become less dangerous. He became more sustainable. Democratic industry, for all its compromises and comforts, proved capable of translating civilian prosperity into military staying power. In that sense, in the end, doctrine met logistics, and logistics won. So return, once more, to that wet Norman field. The mist is lifting now. The guns are farther off. A fly settles on the rim of the cup. The coffee is cooling. Somewhere beyond the hedge, an American engine starts, steady and unhurried, as if the men behind it expect fuel tomorrow, and breakfast the day after that, and victory after both. The German soldier looks down and sees, perhaps for the first time, that the enemy is not merely a line of rifles. It is a society that has solved the morning. And an army that has solved the morning is very hard to stop by evening. Long after the shells were silent, many would remember the war through its grand ruins, burned cities, broken armor, surrendered capitals, the blackened gates of camps, the maps with arrows pushing east and west. But some truths remain hidden in smaller relics. A ration carton, a butter knife, a spoon carved into a K-ration box, the smell of instant coffee and cold air. For men raised on slogans about sacrifice, those objects could feel almost blasphemous. They suggested that freedom might feed itself better than tyranny, that abundance might be stronger than staged hardness, that democracy, for all its noise and appetite in commerce, could still summon discipline enough to cross an ocean and break a war machine. The cup of coffee in the hedgerow was never just coffee. It was steam rising from factories, farms, freight cars, ships, ports, depots, kitchens, and liberties too ordinary to sound heroic until one sees what their absence creates. And that may be the largest truth this small scene leaves behind. Freedom is often discussed in the language of constitutions and battle cries, but ordinary people know it first in quieter forms. Bread that arrives, wages that buy more than fear, speech not rationed by the state, a home where breakfast belongs to the family and not to propaganda. In war, those quiet forms become visible by contrast. A dictatorship can command hunger and call it virtue. It can serve substitute. This plate became a political text. It said that freedom of production, private agriculture, voluntary labor, technological experimentation, and immense logistical coordination could feed a fighting army without turning every cup into an imitation and every meal into a sermon about endurance. It said that a society did not need permanent hunger to produce courage. It said that one could defend a civilization without first stripping it bare. That lesson did not end in 1945. The same food system that astonished German prisoners in camp fed shattered continents afterward. The National Park Service notes that after the war, American food and products, including instant coffee, moved into aid packages for Europe and Japan as devastated societies tried to stand again. In other words, the plate in the hedgerow and the care package in peacetime belonged to the same historical line. The United States had not only built the capacity to arm itself, it had built the capacity to nourish allies, prisoners, and even former enemies. This was not pure innocence. Power never is. But it mattered. When the war ended, the side that had carried coffee, canned meat, sugar, and industrial food science through the fighting also carried those tools into Reconstruction. For some Germans, that may have been the final and strangest turn of all. The civilization they had been told was decadent proved capable not only of defeating them, but of feeding the ruins left behind. There is a temptation, looking back, to reduce such moments to charming anecdotes about culture shock. German soldiers found American food and were amazed. Prisoners tasted butter and beefsteak and reevaluated the world. Yet the deeper truth is harder and more serious. Food in war is philosophy made edible. It tells men what kind of state they serve, what kind of future that state can promise, and whether its promises are made of paper or steel. A breakfast plate on a battlefield is a small thing, but it can reveal the architecture of an age. The Reich had promised hardness and destiny, but by the end it was giving many of its men substitutes, slogans, and retreat. America, imperfect and rationed in its own way, still managed to put coffee in cups, meat in cans, sugar in packets, and heat into the morning of a soldier half a world from home, and rename them destiny. It can tell a soldier that hardness is nobler than comfort right up until he kneels in foreign mud and finds, on an enemy plate, the evidence that another system has outgrown his own. Then history enters through the senses, through smell, through taste, through the ache of wanting one more swallow from a cooling American cup. That is why the plate in Normandy endures as more than a curious wartime image. It is a fragment of a larger revelation, that abundance, when rooted in free production and carried by institutions strong enough to organize it, becomes more than luxury. It becomes resilience. It becomes persuasion. Sometimes it becomes mercy. And sometimes, in the gray dawn of a battlefield, it becomes the first quiet announcement that an ideology built on deprivation has already begun to lose.